When Battlefield 2 launched in June 2005, it was hailed as a triumph by gamers and critics alike. What the community didn't know was that DICE had almost immediately begun work on another game. As Battlefield 2 continued to receive generous amounts of support and new content, first in the form of its Special Forces expansion and soon after its 4 smaller booster packs, rumors began to swirl about something new. In January 2006, a 30-second video leaked online showing wildly futuristic vehicles moving through a city. In March that year, Battlefield 2142 was officially revealed as the next major Battlefield title. Battlefield 2142 officially launched in October 2006 exclusively on PC, the last time a premier Battlefield game would launch only on this platform. And it had a surprisingly good start. I say this because while there were a number of bugs to iron out, there were almost no game-breaking issues, and the one major crash on Titan mode was hotfixed immediately. This is also surprising, given both the very speedy development time that the game had, and the sheer amount of new mechanics and upgrades over the previous Refractor games. Initially, 2142 reception was mixed. Battlefield had always been a fairly grounded franchise portraying historical conflicts. The futuristic setting was something which ruffled many feathers. To the community, there were other franchises out there dealing with sci-fi, and they wanted Battlefield to remain realistic. Nevertheless, 2142 had a closed beta in August 2006, followed by the release of an open demo in late September. The demo featured one map, City Power Plant, and the new 2142 Premier game mode, Titan Assault. It didn't take long for even the most skeptical Battlefield players to recognize that 2142 was something special and deeply enjoyable. After all, it had many of the quirks of Battlefield 2, both good and bad. But it was also a dramatic shift in style, time period, and game mechanics which allowed for something new and fresh. 2142 follows the tried and true style of the Battlefield games which preceded it. There was no single-player campaign, although the universe that DICE created for the game would almost certainly make for a strong one. Instant action, in which players can play against AI bots, is the only solo mode. Everything else is devoted to the multiplayer experience, even going so far to feature a new Friends panel on the menu, which allowed gamers to see which of their friends were online and invite them to a match, if they were lucky and it worked. Multiplayer had a very similar feel to the past. Old Battlefield players could come in and immediately understand how the old-school Conquest game mode worked. The sandbox style of Battlefield was also greatly present. New vehicles and gadgets allowed for wholly new experiences and antics. 2142 also featured hugely popular and beneficial game elements from Battlefield 2. The server browser returned, and for the first time ever, a player queue was added so you didn't need to keep trying repeatedly to join. Game control settings and audio-video settings were almost exactly the same as Battlefield 2. Also, as in Battlefield 2, 2142 featured a BFHQ section in which players could find leaderboards, their statistics, keep track of items unlocked, and rewards obtained such as medals, ribbons, and dog tags. Dog tags in particular were introduced here in 2142, as was the concept of stealing tags of enemies knifed. Tags were counted based on player name and did not include any customizable design like in future titles. The leaderboard also had extra features allowing you to see the stats of players you clicked on. Clicking on the Community tab on the menu brought more great features to light. First, having a news section in these days was surprisingly handy, as prior to the release of Bad Company 2, Battlefield updates needed to be downloaded and patched manually. If you couldn't figure out why you couldn't get into a server, there was probably a patch you needed. Next, there was the Battle Recorder, making its second and final appearance after Battlefield 2. This feature allowed servers to essentially record the entire round that was just played, and store it. players could then go and download it from the server and watch a replay of the entire round from the free cam. This was great for video creation, competitive match casting, and game analysis. Then, of course, there is this button here called Custom Games, which would never be seen again. This is the option in the menus which allowed players to enable game mods. Mod support, which had a huge impact and influence on the world of Battlefield since the beginning in 1942, had one last hurrah in 2142. From high-resolution mods to what was arguably one of the best Star Wars mods of the era, the community used it to come up with some greatly enjoyable gems. From just a brief overview, it appeared as if every part of this game went the extra mile. In terms of game modes, Conquest, despite being prominent, ran parallel to something new and drastically different. Battlefield 2142 featured a new, unique game mode which featured Titans, giant, hovering transport-turned military warships. Players captured control points on the map terrain similar to how normal flags work in Conquest, except each point features a missile silo, which will launch a missile at the enemy team's Titan every 2 minutes. These missiles chip away at the protective shields of the Titans, eventually causing them to break and allowing the enemy team to board the Titan via a variety of methods. Players would then battle their way into the inner structure of the ship, destroying each of the 4 control consoles in numerical order, and access the reactor room. Once inside, they would damage the reactor core to the point where it goes critical, causing an explosive chain reaction resulting in the total destruction of the Titan within about 20 seconds. Enough time for players to evacuate the ship in style. Rounds of Titan assault always began with a ground fight over the map's flags. The commander of each team, a critical role in 2142, were the ones responsible for moving the team's Titan around the map, although the movement speed was incredibly slow. During a round, Titans could eventually be parked immensely close to each other, and players could use the internal launch pods to board the enemy ship. Each team's Titan had a cargo bay where players would inevitably board and infiltrate, and a hangar bay possessing a transport VTOL craft and an attack VTOL craft. Mounted on the bottom of the Titan are 4 cannons which fire a barrage of explosive shells effective against infantry and ground vehicles. A short reload delay occurs after each burst, but the ammo is infinite. On top of the Titan are 2 rapid-firing anti-aircraft guns. These AA guns also have unlimited ammo. Furthermore, they never overheat, nor do they need to be reloaded. All Titan weapons can be destroyed by enemy fire, and repairs are done from inside the hangar bay where all weapon control consoles are located. Of course, if you forgot any of this, 2142 featured a Titan mode tutorial on the main menu. Titan mode was not available on every map in 2142. In fact, Conquest still remained a dominant mode and featured on several maps which were much smaller or infantry-centric. Of the roughly 20 maps which would eventually be part of the game, at least 7 of them had very limited vehicles or could be considered infantry-dominant experiences. These include Operation Shingle, Belgrade, Cerber Landing, Fall of Berlin, Camp Gibraltar, Tunis Harbor, and a remastered strike at Karkand. The larger, more vehicle-heavy maps in the game could also be played in a Conquest variant, but were largely designed for Titan mode. The balance of 2142's maps often left something to be desired. But from an art design and environment perspective, the atmosphere of the future landscape was a masterpiece. Each map felt like it could be from 100 years hence. More importantly, the dreary design frequently communicated a feeling of abandonment, owing to huge populations fleeing to warmer climates. Despite not having a campaign, players received much of the game's lore through the map loading screens, detailing the timeline of the Cold War from the Pack invasion of Europe to their expulsion following a string of EU victories. But as far as game experience goes, many maps had very linear layouts, great potential for base camps, grind-based gameplay, and plenty of spawn killing. Larger maps like Highway Tampa featured too many ground vehicles gained from the flags, which led to camping within the main bases directly. 2142's maps were not all without greatness. Certain maps, like Verdun, Shuhia Taiba, Suez Canal, and Cerber Landing, were incredible experiences in map design regardless of mode. You probably really want to get in on the action now, but hold on there, partner. You couldn't just roll into a new match without understanding the new class system or loadout UI. The deployment menu was an exact copy of Battlefield 2's menu. Where things differed was the classes themselves, which were reduced down to 4 options: Assault, Engineer, Support, and Recon. Assault players had access to the assault rifles, undersling attachments such as the shotgun and rocket pod, and also carried medic equipment such as the medic bag and defibrillator. They also had hand grenades and radar grenades, the first implementation of motion sensor tech in the Battlefield series, acting nearly identical to the motion balls of Battlefield 4 and 2042. Engineer players carried submachine guns and anti-vehicle weapons. 2142 featured 4 unique anti-vehicle weapons: 1 fly-by-wire rocket launcher per faction, 1 unlockable dumbfire Pelham anti-vehicle rifle, and 1 lock-on anti-air launcher. This class also had access to an array of gadgets useful for countering enemy vehicles and protecting allies. These included the repair tool, the AE diffuser, the EMP landmine, the vehicle tracker gizmo, and what is among the most infuriating objects in any game, the IL-29 motion mines. Once deployed, these mines would automatically activate when enemy vehicles were near. Active movement of the enemy vehicle would draw the mines closer until they impacted for significant damage. It was a common occurrence in 2142 to watch vehicles of friend and foe alike try to slowly pull away from the encroaching mines before they inevitably hit. And watch co-pilots scream in the chat,
"Could you possibly try not to hit every single one?" "Sorry, man, they're drifting towards us. I think they're magnetic."
These mines were, in many cases, unavoidable in practical situations, as infantry-based countermeasures required players to exit the vehicle and become vulnerable. Almost laughably, it was only with the DLC pack roughly 6 months post-launch which gave the engineer kit the motion mine bait, which could lure away and detonate the mines. Prior to this, it was exclusively the AE diffuser which had to be used. In retrospect, the design of these mines was hilariously stupid. They frequently were pulled around hidden corners and into the air, couldn't be destroyed with explosives, had an absurd tracking range, and did way too much damage. Next, the support class. As you would expect, this class had light machine guns as the primary weapon, as well as a shotgun option. Gadgets included the RDX explosive pack, the future-y name for C4, EMP grenades, an ammo crate, deployable cover, and the deployable A12 Enforcer sentry gun, predating that asshole Boris by about 16 years. Lastly, there was the Recon class, which essentially was a combination of the Sniper and Special Forces kits of Battlefield 2. Possessing a few different sniper options, as well as a formidable carbine, this kit was very common in 2142 thanks in part to its gadgets. Recon players had the option to equip APM mines, always a fun option, as well as sniper improvements, the RDX explosive packs, and of note, the IT-33 active camouflage system, which when pressed would render the player model 90% invisible, even while moving. Eagle-eyed players could spot enemies using this gadget, and EMP grenades could also disable it. Nevertheless, it had a very lengthy duration and was frequently used to sneak behind enemy lines. Now that we've covered the classes, you're probably asking why I keep talking about equipping gadgets like it's 2042. Before this though, for reference, Battlefield 2 deployment UI had extremely minimal customization. How minimal? Players could only swap between the 3 or so unlockable guns per class. That's it. 2142 introduced a massive game-changing equipment UI in the deployment menu, which allowed players to truly customize their play. Each player could choose one of 3 primary weapons, provided they were unlocked by the server or player. Then, each player could choose 2 of the 5 or 6 gadgets available to the class, again being dependent on whether the player had unlocked them. Some other bonus gadgets, like the Assault Class Med Hub, became a permanently equipped item once unlocked. Lastly, each player had the option to equip a Squad Leader item, although as the name implies, you could only use these if you were the Squad Leader. These Squad Lead items were universal, and had a unique use restriction. The Squad Deployment Beacon could only be activated if the squad contained one other active squad mate. The Otis radar drone followed the squad leader around and would mark nearby enemy players on the minimap. This was only accessible if the squad had 2 other active players. Finally, if the squad leaders had 3 other players in their squad, they could activate the SD-8 Accipiter Flying Sentry Gun, which, like the radar drone, would automatically follow the squad leader around the map. Lastly, Battlefield 2142 included a heavy body armor option for each class. Equipping the body armor would increase damage resistance to the body and limbs, but not to the head. It would also reduce the stamina meter by 50%. The amount of gadgets and modifications players could apply to their kit was pretty extraordinary. I didn't even touch on all of them. To actually use most of the weapons, items, and gadgets of 2142 though, players would need to rank up in-game by accumulating score, boosted by earning ribbons and medals for accomplishing more difficult tasks. When a player ranks up, they earn a token, which they could use in the BFHQ to unlock a single piece of equipment at a time. This was something tediously slow, as higher ranks really had some hefty point requirements. The game featured 40 normal ranks, but also had 3 further ranks beyond the normal maximum. These were constantly shifting ranks, which were entirely dependent on the player's global leaderboard ranking. 75 players at a time were promoted to Major General. 25 players at a time were promoted to Lieutenant General. And one player was promoted to Supreme Commander. 1 player to rule them all. Ha! The truth is, the Supreme Commander actually didn't get anything special short of that rank. While 2142's equipment loadout system was truly a marvel of its time and one of the first of its kind in the Battlefield series, it was definitely primitive and had some significant disadvantages. First and foremost, when players started reaching higher levels and accumulating more gadgets, the system became cumbersome in-game. The amount of items players could bring to a round meant that they were switching items all the way down to their 7 or 8 keys. Sometimes, needing the right gadget in a tight spot would result in a misclick down the keyboard, causing frustration. Another issue with the amount of gadgets was that switching between them could sometimes be a buggy affair, with weapons and gadgets getting their animations locked or rubber banding back to the previous item. Nevertheless, this system laid the groundwork for significant player customization options for all future Battlefield titles. Let's discuss some other game mechanics of 2142. The sprint feature makes a second appearance following Battlefield 2, although this time around the amount of stamina has been massively increased, and players could run a marathon at a time provided they don't have body armor on. The game also introduced EMP mechanics to Battlefield, and while player opinion of the time was mixed, In retrospect, it is clear that the effects went way too far. Short-circuiting player HUDs is one thing. Completely making a vehicle useless is another. A vehicle hit by any form of EMP in the game not only loses its ability to fire, but also shuts down completely and is unable to move. In 2142, this EMP effect could be chained via multiple grenades and multiple players to permanently disable a vehicle. The EMP abilities also had friendly fire, which could be accidental or just another griefing opportunity. It is safe to say that this feature went a bit overboard in 2142. As mentioned earlier, commanders also made a return from Battlefield 2 in a pretty impactful way, at least in Titan mode. In Conquest, their role felt similar to their Battlefield 2 capacity along with the same options. UAV, SAT scan, supply drop, and artillery strike. The new ability being an EMP artillery strike, halting vehicles and shorting out player equipment. The commander's assets returned as well. These objects placed in the main bases allowed the commander abilities to function, and naturally could be destroyed by infiltrating players. This did, however, have the double-edged effect of main base vehicles being mined, stolen, and players spawn camped. The game's movement should also be addressed. In February 2006, Battlefield 2 received what many die-hard fans consider a disastrous patch. Battlefield 2 launched with some wild movement physics. Movement, whether sprinting, jumping, diving, or air strafing, was smooth, albeit very abusable. On top of other bugs like recoil reset prone spamming, the addition of the new sprint mechanic had unintended consequences of causing invulnerable prone dives and hitbox breaking sprint jumps. Battlefield 2's patch 1.2 put most of this in the coffin in an extreme manner. Perhaps limited in what DICE could change without a full redesign, shooting while jumping was disabled. Large delays were added to changes in stance. Dolphin diving killed entirely. The ability to throw items via fast inputs was nerfed, and the sprint jump castrated. While some of these changes were needed, DICE's solutions changed movement in Battlefield 2 drastically. It would forever feel clunky, slow, unresponsive, and jittery. Meanwhile, behind the scenes with 2142 in development, DICE implemented the exact same heavy-handed movement fixes to prevent exploits and community complaints. While 2142 would feel the exact same way on its launch as Battlefield 2 had felt for months, it nevertheless is disappointing that alternative programming solutions couldn't be found to keep the movement from ending up arguably more glitchy than its predecessor. As I just mentioned, a root cause of these issues was the sprint mechanic, but the fatal flaw was its combination with the Refractor engine's extremely buggy physics coding. In the Refractor engine, when two opposing movements contradicted each other, the result was typically jittery collisions and rubber banding. Evidence of this went back to Battlefield 1942, when simply walking on a moving ship felt like the game would break at any moment. In 2142, the implementation of wild vehicle abilities and multiple gadgets had similar results. But the biggest disruptor of 2142 movement was the Titans. And while even at the slightest movement speed, it had the same effect on player movement as 1942 warships. Getting Titans close together on a map sometimes exacerbated this trouble, and when assaulting inside the Titan, player models had a strong tendency to warp, collide, rubber band, and body block with other teammates. While Battlefield 2142 had some of the most incredible gameplay ideas and mechanics ever to grace the franchise, the limitations of the engine really let it down, and player frustrations with movement physics inevitably was a reason for criticism and a drop in players. As previously mentioned, Battlefield 2's lone customization option was its limited weapon selection. 2142 really doesn't expand on this yet, and it would be the release of Bad Company 2 which finally saw large amounts of gun options. What 2142 does, incredibly I might add, is create some of the coolest, cleanest, most enjoyable futuristic weapons in an FPS title. Alongside the atmosphere of the maps, DICE developers nailed the look and feel of the weapons, which truly demonstrate innovative sci-fi advances in technology and style. Everything from the models, to the sound effects, to the gorgeous reload animations, it is fantastic and makes anything you want to use an enjoyable experience. Mostly. While the weapon design is excellent, using them can sometimes be another story. Unfortunately, 2142 has one of the oddest gunplay styles of any Battlefield game. Going beyond BF2 before it, 2142 incorporates wild bullet spread from nearly every firearm. Regardless if you are firing an SMG or assault rifle, winning a gunfight is often about luck. Sadly, the bullet spread is just one factor in this equation. Combined with movement clunkiness, game netcode, and low server tick rate, bullets can sometimes be just as imaginary as the game's environment. Dusting is common just as it is in Battlefield 2, a result of the game's legacy netcode failing to resend packets, and anything from server lag to a mildly unstable internet connection can cause hit-reg problems. For years, some players have argued that the netcode is wholly responsible for the game's weapon issues, while others argue that 2142 in fact had decent hit-reg, it was just a combination of movement and weapon spread at fault. Evidence for this is present in the fact that vehicle weapons from the tank turrets, to the APC guns, to even the LMGs on the speedy ocelots seem to hit reliably and are highly effective. This is also supported by many vehicles in Battlefield 2 often doing the same thing. It is very possible that multiple factors contribute to 2142's hit-reg issues. I personally fall into the latter camp, in full belief that the fault largely lies with the weapons themselves. The strongest argument for simple, poor design lies with the LMGs of the support class. Unlike nearly every other Battlefield game, the LMGs of 2142 always have a wide spread and large crosshair upon initially firing. Continuous firing of the guns quickly shrinks the target reticle and greatly narrows the cone of fire. Using any LMG at its highest efficiency vastly increases hit indicators against infantry targets and can quickly eliminate multiple enemy players even without being prone. Although these weapons are highly inefficient without this spooling up time for the crosshair, this makes playing the support class a highly effective option, and offers proof that the gunplay was just poorly designed. In any case, playing it today, just as it did in its prime, requires a strong tolerance for wacky and often frustrating gun engagements. When people talk about Battlefield 2142, one of the first things bound to be brought up are the vehicles. This game succeeded in bringing to life not only a world ravaged by drastic environmental change, but also by imagining the futuristic vehicles which might be at war within it. In 2142, ground armor was the first to receive a radical change. The EU A8 Tiger tank is among the most recognizable vehicles due to its old-school design and movement. Meanwhile, the PaK Type 32 Nekomata tank is truly a drastic innovation, hovering above the ground and moving freely on its horizontal axis. It is far more difficult to drive, as the turret doesn't swivel. Instead, the entire tank must sway left and right to aim at a target. One unique thing about tanks in 2142 is that neither of them possess a coaxial LMG. The driver only has the main cannon. The passenger gunner, while being safely inside the tank, has control over a powerful secondary gun with full 360-degree rotation. In this way, tanks were definitely not as strong as they are in other Battlefield games, even when players are working closely together. APCs also had a major upgrade. Unlike their modern counterparts, the APCs of 2142 are not meant for head-on vehicular engagements. Like the tanks, they are designed for coordinated play, as the drivers lack a main cannon and possess only an LMG as a primary weapon. The driver also has a secondary EMP launcher which can disable any enemy vehicle, making it an incredible support asset when teamed with other ground armor. The secondary seat of the vehicle possesses a 3-round explosive cannon which does heavy damage, although has a large arc. These APCs also have another major ability. Players in the seats 3 through 6 can right-click on their mouse to engage the launch pods, sending them a few hundred feet in the air in controlled movement. With this ability, players can launch onto certain buildings, quickly traverse, flank, and assault enemy positions, and board titans in the sky. Far and away, the most iconic ground vehicle of 2142 is the Battle Walker. It is extremely powerful, and without a doubt the most fun to drive. Mech warrior players will feel right at home, even if the weapons seem limited. There are 2 walkers in the game, each with 2 weapon types. The EU Resig, which has dual-mounted miniguns and rocket pods, and the PAC Bogatyr with a center plasma cannon as well as its own secondary rocket pods. Each Battle Walker's primary weapons only do damage to infantry and light vehicles, while the secondary anti-vehicle rocket pods are effective, but odd. When fired, they do not have a direct flight path, instead loop and arc around. This sometimes causes them to miss targets entirely. These rockets also do not fire in a set salvo. Instead, each generates a small overcharge which must dissipate before another rocket can be fired. The top mounted gunner seats on the walkers feature 2 weapons: a fast-firing heavy machine gun useful against infantry and air vehicles, and a secondary AA missile launcher. Ultimately, well-coordinated team play between pilot and gunner can make it an immensely potent vehicle in any situation. Taking to the skies of 2142, players will quickly discover that the transport and attack VTOL aircraft dominate as replacements for the jets and helicopters of games past. Depending on each map and game type, VTOL aircraft can be found in main bases on the ground or in the hangar bay on the Titans. The transport VTOLs are operated by 1 pilot, 2 gunner passengers which each have access to a side Gatling gun, and 4 seated passengers. While not the fastest craft, the miniguns can be extremely effective. Simply by exiting the craft, passengers will drop via the same pod system and safely land on the ground below. The attack VTOL aircraft are simultaneously the most difficult vehicle in 2142 to control, as well as being the strongest in the game once properly mastered. These craft are most similar to attack helicopters in other titles, possessing rocket pods for the pilot and for the gunner a nose-mounted machine gun and TV missile. These vehicles, however, can be extremely difficult to fly, sometimes pitching in awkward directions at imprecise moments. Nevertheless, they are extremely fast and thread the line between jet and helicopter, as well as have a few other surprises. The pilot-fired missile pods automatically track enemy aircraft, making them extremely effective. Almost too effective. The pilot also has the ability to activate the active defense system, which can block enemy missiles for a short time. In a very poor design decision, the TV missile of the attack VTOL also has the same damage model of Battlefield 2's TV missiles, being able to one-shot nearly any vehicle on a direct hit. The only difference is that 2142 reintroduced the mouse movement directional input method for them, as opposed to the mouse-click method of Battlefield 2. Despite being lightly armored, expert pilots could solo these attack craft and destroy any ground vehicle in a single pass, infuriating enemy players. Having just mentioned the active defense system on the attack VTOL, It is important to note that every major vehicle in 2142 had this system available for the driver or pilot. While many BF players assume that the APS system of Battlefield 4 was the first iteration, 2142 was in fact the first. Unfortunately, due to the game's poor server tick rate and overall mediocre netcode, the active defense system was extremely buggy and frequently allowed enemy shells and rockets to pass through. Nevertheless, having this futuristic system on nigh every vehicle did create some intense, skill-based moments between vehicles when it worked correctly. Battlefield 2142 featured a soundtrack by composer Gregor Narholz, his only entry to the Battlefield series. Totaling about 37 minutes, 2142's score is a duality of a bleak world and a destructive war, blending the haunting, cold environment in which it is waged, with powerful, bombastic melodies representing the monstrous vehicles now roaming the planet. Each of the original maps has its own unique music, while the game itself has one of the best versions of the main Battlefield theme. Overall, 2142's soundtrack is extremely underrated, and it deserves praise not only because of how good it is, but because it was also the first Battlefield game up to that point which featured a lengthy original score. On March 8, 2007, 2142 received its first and only DLC pack called Northern Strike. This DLC was one of the first times in the Battlefield series which content could be downloaded directly instead of needing a physical copy. As far as content goes, it was extremely limited, seemingly the bare minimum which was required to package and ship. It included 3 new maps, 2 new vehicles, 6 new badges, a new game mode called Assault Lines, which was just a minor variant of Conquest Assault, and a handful of gadgets, some of which have already been mentioned in this video. Of the 10 gadgets added, the most impactful was the motion mine bait, slightly mitigating the rage caused by motion ball mines. On June 30th, 2014, Battlefield 2142 was one of the many casualties of the mass Gamespy server shutdown. While single-player instant action games remained available, all multiplayer services ceased. Prior to this shutdown, the Refractor Engine Battlefield games still enjoyed strong support among the community, and the player populations remained surprisingly active. This community involvement sought alternative server backend methods. Although it took nearly 2 years, the Battlefield 2142 Revive project launched in September 2016 with an alternative server system. This generated a lot of community fanfare, and sometimes over 1,000 gamers at a time could be found enjoying the game again. This solution was not to last, however, as the Revive project had been making use of the EA trademarks, logos, and other artwork. And around October of 2017, EA formally sent a very kind request to cease the operation, to which the project acquiesced. Not long after, the community once again came to the rescue of 2142, this time in the form of the 2142 Reclamation Project, this time carefully avoiding the legal infringement of EA's copyright. To this day, the Reclamation Project remains the only way to play 2142 online. While the player numbers are definitely small, on certain weekends you might be able to find a highly populated server, an incredible feat today. If you are interested in checking it out, I have posted instructions in the pinned comment and the description of this video. Some 16 years after 2142's launch, where does it sit in the grand history of Battlefield? Truthfully, it largely lays forgotten by the modern Battlefield community, except to those who played it. While time was not kind to most of the Refractor-era games, 2142, with what ultimately was the greatest experience and design on that engine, nevertheless failed to cement its legacy the way that Battlefield 2 did. 2142 had multiple forces working against it. It was a futuristic title in a series of notably historical games. It launched while Battlefield 2 was still in its prime. It failed to drastically improve the networking and physics components of its engine. And it had such a short development time for such an ambitious project. Ultimately, it did make enough of a splash in the series to warrant at least talk of a sequel, though it has never materialized. Instead, any post-game references to 2142 have been limited to Easter eggs in Battlefield 3, which contains some floaty objects, and far more significantly, the Final Stand DLC of Battlefield 4. Battlefield 4's last content DLC was the closest Battlefield gamers have come to returning to the world of 2142. The DLC pack contained 4 maps, which were at least set in a slight future to the BF4 timeline. The maps themselves were littered with content and references to 2142, essentially acting as a prelude to the future war. Hover tanks were still prototypes, battle walkers were under construction in Karelia, and the first of the mighty Titans were being tested and constructed in a mountain hangar, which could be accessed via the prototype launch pods. Weapons such as the railgun and the Accipiter drone were available, and icons on the walls displayed the logo of the Pan-Asian Coalition faction. While the Final Stand DLC was essentially a love letter to 2142 players, it somewhat felt hollow, out of place, and incomplete, as fans felt like DICE should have committed to a full title, while other Battlefield players, having not the slightest idea of 2142's existence, could always be counted on to complain that the tech in the game makes no sense and isn't realistic, perpetually unaware of the references. While not entirely a 2142 reference, BF4 also introduced a carrier assault game mode in its Naval Strike DLC, which was essentially a reworked version of Titan Assault, and worked largely the same way. However, it really didn't catch on in BF4. I would argue that there were a few reasons for this, ranging from the poor maps it was played on, a lack of interest in storming an aircraft carrier by boat, lack of significant airborne verticality, and it being a pale shadow of a great game mode designed for a science fiction environment. Battlefield 2142 broke a lot of new ground for the Battlefield series. It was the first to try and unseat Conquest as the game's main multiplayer mode. It featured a drastically more complex soldier customization system which included multiple weapons per class. Wildly new game mechanics gave new options for movement across the map. Vehicles, gadgets, and weapons were completely redesigned for a truly futuristic conflict. And speaking of the future, 2142 remains the only drastically science fiction type Battlefield in the series, as even Battlefield 2042 hails from an uncomfortably close time span. The look and feel of 2142 was revolutionary. In short, it is the definitive edition of what DICE developers could scrape out of the Refractor engine. Many grievances and features from previous titles were fixed and improved upon. Nearly. And finally, the game was just plain cool. Yet, 2142 was far from perfect. Spotty records and offhand comments by devs seem to indicate that 2142 had a much smaller development team working on it than Battlefield 2, and it only had little more than a year of full development time. Given that the game launched roughly 16 months after Battlefield 2, this seems a logical assessment. Many features of the game, despite significant improvements, feel too ambitious in design or launched without polish. Wild vehicle physics, buggy terrain obstacles, game crashes, game rubber banding and stuttering, a jittery UI, movement which often feels like it's being restricted by a million settings, strange gun recoil and incomprehensible bullet spread, and numerous other bugs made it not only into launch, but often persist far past its prime. There was no additional terrain or object destruction, and just like all previous Refractor Engine games, simple objects like fences, streetlights, trash cans, and small trees couldn't be destroyed or driven through. To have experienced 2142 in its heyday, gamers would have been given every single feature a proper Battlefield game should have in order to succeed. But ultimately, it is these issues which just drag it down and continue to invoke frustrations. Like Battlefield Vietnam, 2142 came to be seen by many as the spin-off sequel to the game prior, a better build, or even a total conversion mod of Battlefield 2. While I don't disagree with those assessments, it had significant purpose as many of the mechanics and lessons of 2142 would eventually find their way into the development of Battlefield Bad Company and Bad Company 2, and later even Battlefield 3. Moreover, to players of Battlefield 2, 2142 was something groundbreaking and wildly enjoyable even with its faults. So much so that it continues to be played today. And beyond that, calls for a proper, modern sequel or remake of the game remain incredibly high. It would not surprise me in the slightest to eventually see a proper return to the world of 2142 from DICE. In all honesty, the game's largest fault remains its short development time and inadequate engine. There is just so much more that can be done with this game's vehicles, lore, game modes, and mechanics on a modern engine. Regardless of its inherent technical issues, Battlefield 2142 remains a highly enjoyable, if flawed, classic, one which deserves a modern sequel. 8 out of 10.